It was one of those summer afternoons when the air seemed to stick to your skin, the kind of heat that made even the city's busiest streets feel slow. The tinted glass of the black sedan reflected the gold of the sun as it waited in front of the polished steel and glass headquarters. People walked past, heads down, phones in hand, their footsteps a quick rhythm on the sidewalk. To them, this was just another day in the financial heart of the city. But inside that car, the leather seats were cold, the air conditioning humming, and the driver kept glancing at the rearview mirror, waiting. He always came out at exactly 5:07, never earlier, never later. The security team called it a habit, but it was more than that. It was control. Every moment of his day was arranged in neat, deliberate blocks. To most people, he was the picture of success, the kind of man who made headlines when he closed a deal, whose name appeared in glossy magazines beside words like visionary and self-made. His suits were tailored, his watches imported, and his voice carried the quiet weight of someone used to being listened to. But those who worked close to him knew there was another side. The sharpness that came when things didn't go his way. The way his smile sometimes disappeared mid-sentence, leaving behind an expression that made the air in the room feel thinner. When he stepped out of the building, the glass doors caught his reflection. Tall, confident, moving with the kind of ease that came from never having to worry about what came next. He adjusted his cufflinks as if even the smallest detail needed to be perfect, then slid into the back seat without looking at the driver. His phone was already in his hand, thumb moving fast over the screen, his attention narrowed to whatever deal or conversation he was running from behind those dark lenses. The first few minutes passed as they always did. The car moved through the city's late afternoon traffic, the driver silent, the man in the back focused on his phone. The hum of the engine was steady, the city outside a blur of brick buildings and neon signs. But then, at a stoplight, the driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. Not at the man, but at the small figure, now sitting beside him. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Her hair was tied in neat braids, the ends clicking softly when she moved. She was wearing a faded yellow dress, her knees drawn close, and her hands resting still in her lap. There was something about her face, calm, almost too calm, that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. She turned her head slightly, her gaze fixed on the man beside her. He didn't notice at first, too absorbed in whatever was on his screen. Then she spoke. Just 2 words. Her voice clear, steady, and low. "Shut up." The words cut through the quiet like a blade. His head jerked up, his sunglasses slipping down his nose as he stared at her. It wasn't anger that crossed his face first. It was confusion, the kind that comes when the world tilts in a way you can't explain. His lips parted as if to say something, but she just kept looking at him, unblinking, as if she were waiting for him to realize something on his own. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. The light turned green, and the car rolled forward. But the space inside felt smaller now, heavier. The man's voice came out sharper than he intended. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed steady, her expression unreadable. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a quick cold rush in his chest that had nothing to do with anger or control. It was the feeling of not being in charge. Outside, the city kept moving as if nothing had shifted. But in that car, something had. Neither of them spoke, yet the air between them was full of a question that no one wanted to ask out loud. And somewhere deep down, in the quiet space behind his practiced confidence, he knew that whatever the answer was, it wasn't going to be simple. The car ride that day didn't end the way it was supposed to. Instead of going straight to his penthouse, he told the driver to circle the city for an hour. He said nothing else, didn't look at the girl again, but his mind wouldn't stop trying to figure out where she came from and how she had gotten into his car. He replayed her voice in his head, the steady way she'd said "shut up" Not loud, not scared, just certain. People didn't speak to him like that, least of all strangers. When they finally pulled up to the private garage, the girl was gone. No sound of the door opening, no footsteps, no shift in the leather seat. She had simply vanished, as if she'd never been there. He told himself he must have imagined it, maybe stress or lack of sleep playing tricks on him. But later that night, as he sat in the silent glow of the city lights pouring into his glass-walled living room, he could swear he saw her reflection in the window, sitting where there was no one. Over the next week, his usual rhythm began to break. Meetings ran late because he was distracted. He snapped at his assistant for mistakes she hadn't made. His driver said nothing, but he noticed how the man's eyes sometimes lingered on the empty back seat in the rearview mirror. Once, in the middle of a conference call, he thought he heard her voice again, faint but clear, telling him to be quiet. He turned so fast his chair hit the desk, but there was no one there. The cracks widened. At a board dinner he barely touched his food, watching people talk around him with tight smiles. Every so often, someone would meet his eyes, and he'd catch the flicker of something, pity, maybe, or suspicion. It wasn't like him to be on edge, but the girl's face kept pulling him back to something he couldn't name. And under it all, an old thought returned, one he hadn't let himself think in years. Maybe money didn't buy safety. Then came the first real shift. One night, after a tense meeting about an acquisition, he found a small folded note on the seat of his car. It was in a child's handwriting, uneven letters pressed hard into the paper. Stop talking. He didn't show anyone. He tore it up in the elevator and let the pieces fall between the cracks of the marble floor. But the feeling it left in him didn't go away. External pressures started pressing harder. There were rumors in the press about unethical deals, nothing proven, but enough to make investors nervous. A competitor had begun undercutting his contracts. Even at home he felt the air change. His partner, who used to let him dominate the conversation, now questioned him more often, her tone sharper, her eyes searching his face as though she saw something she hadn't noticed before. It felt like everyone was waiting for him to make a mistake. His temper became a living thing. When his head of marketing pushed back on a campaign idea, he slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the glasses jump. At a gala, he told a junior executive to remember her place when she offered an opinion he didn't like. The control he once wore like armor was slipping, and people were starting to see the cracks. And then the girl came back. It was late, after midnight, and he was in the back of the car scrolling through a financial report when she appeared beside him again. No sound, no warning, just sitting there in that faded yellow dress, watching him. He froze, his phone slipping from his hand to the seat. "What do you want?" His voice was low, strained. She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, like she was studying him, then leaned forward just enough to say, "You already know." His chest tightened. There were things he'd done, things he told himself were just part of the game, the way powerful people survived. But hearing it like that, from a child who shouldn't even be there, made it feel heavier, uglier. Before he could respond, she was gone again, the space beside him empty, the air still holding the faint scent of something sweet and unfamiliar. From that night, sleep became a stranger. He started drinking more, telling himself it was to take the edge off. He skipped workouts, let emails go unanswered, and kept the blinds closed in his apartment, even during the day. His partner began avoiding him, staying late at work, sometimes not coming home at all. He found himself checking the shadows in every room, the corners of the elevator, even the rearview mirror when he was alone in the car. There were moments when he almost told someone, his driver, his assistant, even his lawyer. But every time the thought of saying it out loud made his skin crawl. Who would believe him? And if they did, what would they think he'd done to deserve it? Then came the charity event. It was supposed to be another routine night of speeches, champagne and handshakes. But as he stood at the microphone thanking donors, he saw her in the crowd. She wasn't dressed for the occasion, still the same yellow dress, still those calm eyes, but she was standing between two executives who didn't seem to notice her at all. His voice caught just for a second, and when it did, he swore he heard her whisper, "Not much longer." From that point, everything accelerated. Deals fell apart without warning. Old associates stopped returning calls. One morning, he woke to find an unmarked envelope slid under his door. Inside was a photograph of him from years ago, standing beside a man who had since disappeared under suspicious circumstances. On the back, in the same uneven handwriting as the note in his car, were the words, "Time's up." He started suspecting everyone: his driver, his assistant, his partner. Every look felt loaded, every silence intentional. When his partner asked if something was wrong, he accused her of knowing more than she let on. She left the apartment that night and didn't come back. The girl's appearances became more frequent, each time cutting deeper into his nerves. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she'd tell him to stop talking, or to listen, or to remember. He didn't know if she was real, if she was a ghost, or just the shape of his guilt finally taking form. But she was always there at the moments he least expected, moments when his control slipped far enough for someone else to see the man beneath the suit. And beneath it all was the constant hum of dread, the sense that everything around him was tightening, drawing him towards something he couldn't avoid. He was used to pulling the strings, to bending situations until they worked in his favor. But now, it felt like someone else was holding the line, and it was only a matter of time before they yanked it hard enough to make everything snap. The crime wasn't here yet, but the world around him had shifted, and every step he took felt like it was on a floor that could give way at any moment. The night it happened was colder than it should have been for summer, the kind of chill that slid under doors and settled in your bones. The city outside was alive with neon and noise, but inside his penthouse, the air was still. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline of glittering towers, but he wasn't looking at any of it. He was pacing, drink in hand, the amber liquid trembling with every step. He had spent the whole day trying to keep it together. Meetings, phone calls, polite smiles. But it had all felt like an act he couldn't keep up much longer. The girl had been there again that morning. He'd opened his eyes and found her standing at the foot of his bed, hands clasped, head tilted. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes had been enough to make him feel as if someone had poured ice water down his spine. By evening, the tension was eating at him from the inside. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt closer than it should. When the knock came at his door, it was soft, almost polite, but it still made his pulse jump. He set the glass down and opened the door to find his partner standing there. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her expression tight. "We need to talk," she said, voice clipped. It started as an argument about business, about the money moving out of accounts, the deals crumbling, the whispers in the industry, but quickly turned into something more personal. She accused him of hiding things. He accused her of betrayal. The words came faster, sharper, until they weren't about money or work at all. They were about trust, about control, about years of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface. And then, in the middle of it, he saw her. The girl. She was standing in the corner of the room, her yellow dress bright against the shadows. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. His partner didn't notice her, or maybe she did, and chose not to say anything. But her voice kept cutting through the room, each word landing like a strike. The girl's gaze didn't shift from him, and he felt himself splintering under it. She was here for a reason. He was sure of it now, and whatever was coming, he couldn't stop it. His partner said something then, something sharp and final, and he didn't even hear the words. All he saw was the girl's lips moving in perfect sync with his partner's, whispering the same 2 words she'd said that first day. "Shut up." Something inside him snapped. His hands moved before his mind caught up. The glass from the table was in his grip, heavy and cold, and then it was in the air, swinging. The sound it made when it connected was muffled, almost dull, but the silence that followed was deafening. She crumpled to the floor, one hand pressed to the side of her head, blood seeping between her fingers. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood, the pieces skittering across the room like scattered thoughts. For a moment he just stood there, frozen. The girl was gone. Not a trace of her in the corner, not a sound, not a shadow. It was just him, the broken glass, and the woman on the floor. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow gasps. His mind screamed at him to do something, help her, call someone. But another voice, low and steady, told him it was too late for that. The panic came in waves. First, the thought that maybe she wasn't dead. Then the fear that she was. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking so badly he could barely feel for a pulse. She was still breathing, but faint, ragged. His fingers came away wet with blood, and the sight of it made his stomach turn. He told himself it was an accident, that she'd pushed him too far, that anyone in his position would have done the same. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. The truth was simpler and darker. He'd wanted her to stop talking, just like the girl had told him to. In the minutes that followed, everything blurred. He grabbed towels from the bathroom, pressed them to the wound, all while his mind raced with calculations. Calling for help meant questions, police, press, investigations. It meant the end of everything he'd built. So he did the thing he'd always done when cornered. He took control. He dragged her to the sofa, positioned her so she looked like she'd simply fallen asleep, and cleaned the blood from the floor as best he could. The towels went into a trash bag, along with the glass shards, the bottle, and anything that might connect the scene to what had happened. When it was done, he stood in the center of the room, looking at her. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She might wake up. She might not. But either way, the moment was already locked in place, irreversible. He poured himself another drink, his hands still trembling, and sank into the chair across from her. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, the city kept moving, unaware of what had just shifted inside this room. And in the reflection on the window, faint but undeniable, the girl was there again, sitting, waiting, her eyes fixed on him. He didn't look away this time. The hours after it happened passed in a strange haze, the kind where time seemed to bend and fold in on itself. He sat across from her for what could have been minutes or hours, the ice melting in his untouched glass, the city lights blinking beyond the windows. Every so often he'd glance at her chest to make sure it was still rising. It was. That should have brought him relief, but it didn't. All it did was stretch the tension into something unbearable, a waiting game with no clear end. When he finally stood, his legs felt heavy, his movements mechanical. He told himself he'd figure it out in the morning, that the night was too deep and dangerous for decisions. He covered her with a throw blanket, not out of care, but to hide the wound from his own eyes. Then he closed himself in the bedroom, locking the door, as if that thin barrier could keep the truth out. The next morning, she was gone. The blanket was folded neatly on the couch, the towels from the bathroom missing, and the front door left slightly ajar. For a moment, he thought he might have dreamed the whole thing, until he saw the faint reddish-brown smear on the edge of the glass coffee table. She hadn't gone to the police. Not yet. But the silence felt heavier than an accusation. In the days that followed, he became hyper-aware of every look, every pause in conversation. His assistant's smile seemed tighter. The driver's eyes met his in the rearview mirror a second too long. At the office, conversation stopped when he walked into a room. Nothing direct, nothing spoken. But it was there, an unspoken shift in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to surface. He told himself it was fine. She hadn't said anything because she knew it would destroy them both. They'd been tied together for too long, financially, socially, personally, for either of them to come out clean. That logic worked during the day, when he was surrounded by noise and movement. But at night, in the stillness of his penthouse, it fell apart. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice, hearing the girl's voice, until he thought the quiet would crush him. The media picked up on the changes before anyone else said a word. A gossip column ran a piece about him looking noticeably strained at a charity gala. A financial blog hinted at internal instability in his company's leadership. These were the kinds of rumors he'd usually swat away with one phone call, but this time he let them hang in the air. The fight to control the narrative suddenly felt like more effort than it was worth. The people closest to him started to drift. Friends he'd known for years stopped inviting him to dinners. A board member quietly suggested he take some time off for optics. Investors wanted reassurances he couldn't convincingly give. The version of himself he had built, polished, untouchable, in control, was beginning to crumble in front of them, and they were stepping back to avoid being caught in the fall. And yet, he never saw her again. Not his partner, not the girl in the yellow dress. Some nights, he half convinced himself they were the same person, that one had been sent to deliver the other's message. Other nights he wondered if the girl had only ever existed in his head, a manifestation of whatever rot he'd been carrying all these years. The guilt was a strange thing, shifting, unpredictable. Some mornings, it sat on him like a weight, crushing his chest until he could barely breathe. Other days it receded, replaced by a cold, detached reasoning that told him he'd done what was necessary, that she'd provoked him, that the world was cruel, and he'd simply matched its cruelty. He knew that was the dangerous part, not the guilt, but the ease with which he could sometimes push it away. Outside, the world moved on. The city didn't care about one fight in one apartment, but in certain circles, whispers grew. At a networking event, he caught two executives watching him with the kind of interest that wasn't about business. At a restaurant, a stranger at the bar muttered his name with a smirk that made his skin crawl. Whatever had happened between those walls, it had left a mark he couldn't scrub off. In quieter moments, he thought about the people who had once looked at him with respect, the employees who had believed his speeches about integrity, the friends who had defended him when rivals tried to tear him down. The idea that those people might now see him as a man capable of violence gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. But the truth was, he was that man, and pretending otherwise was a kind of lie he no longer had the energy to tell. He stayed out of the spotlight, telling the board he needed to focus on strategic planning from home. But in reality, he spent most days staring at the skyline, waiting for something, her, the police, the girl in yellow to appear. The knock never came. The phone never rang. That silence became its own kind of punishment, stretching longer and tighter until it felt like a rope around his neck. In the end, it wasn't the law or the press that undid him. It was himself. The insomnia worsened. His drinking got heavier. He started missing calls, forgetting meetings, and once in the middle of a conversation with a major client, he simply stopped speaking and walked out of the room. The man who had once seemed incapable of weakness now looked like someone unraveling in slow motion, and no one wanted to be near when the final thread came loose. Some nights, he thought about leaving the city, disappearing into another country under another name. But he knew he'd take the same weight with him, the same sleepless nights, the same image of her on the floor with blood between her fingers. And always, somewhere in the corner of his mind, the girl in the yellow dress, watching. In the months that followed, the silence finally broke, but not in the way he had feared. There was no police raid, no sudden media expose with headlines screaming his guilt. Instead, the fallout came in slow, deliberate waves. his partner never returned. And though no charges were filed, her absence became its own kind of testimony. People didn't need a court case to know something had happened. They could see it in the way his name began to vanish from invitations, in the way business partners excused themselves from deals that once seemed certain. His reputation didn't shatter overnight. It eroded, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. The company he had built, his fortress, his proof of worth, became his undoing. Investors demanded stability, and when he couldn't provide it, the board moved quietly to push him out. The announcement in the press was polite, all talk of personal reasons and a new chapter, but those buyers who paid attention understood it for what it was. By the end of the year, his office was cleared, his name removed from the building's directory. He was not arrested. There were no trials, no headlines with his mugshot. To some, that was proof that the system favored him, that wealth and connections could shield a man from the kind of scrutiny others would never escape. To others, it was a sign that whatever had happened between him and his partner was something they had chosen to keep private. But the absence of legal consequence didn't mean there was no punishment. The isolation was absolute. The man who once thrived on being seen now avoided the public altogether, moving through the city like a shadow. For him, the punishment was internal. Nights stretched long and restless. The girl in the yellow dress still appeared, sometimes in mirrors, sometimes in the corner of a dimly lit room. She never spoke anymore, but her presence carried the same quiet weight, a reminder that some acts could not be buried. He tried to drown her out with noise, with drink, with endless scrolling through meaningless headlines, but she always returned. For the community around him, the story took on a different shape. In whispered conversations, it became a cautionary tale, not just about violence, but about the illusion of invincibility. People spoke of power like it was a drug, one that could twist a man until he no longer recognized the line between control and cruelty. In certain circles, his name became shorthand for what happened when arrogance went unchecked. Societally, nothing changed in any official sense. There were no new laws, no public campaigns inspired by what happened. But on a smaller, more human scale, the ripples spread. A few executives in his industry started paying more attention to the way they treated those closest to them. Some women in his social circle quietly distanced themselves from partners whose tempers they'd once excused. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a shift, small, subtle, and invisible to anyone not looking closely. The question of justice lingered without a clean answer. Was it justice that he'd lost his career, his standing, and the trust of everyone who once believed in him? Or was it injustice that he'd never faced the same consequences as another man without his resources would have? The truth sat somewhere in the uneasy space between those points. Morally, his story was less about a single moment of violence and more about the slow corrosion that led to it. Power had insulated him for so long that he mistook it for permission. When the cracks began to show, through business failures, personal betrayals, and the haunting presence of the girl, it exposed how fragile that power really was. His downfall wasn't just the result of one night, but of years spent believing there were no rules he couldn't bend. In the end, he lived with what he'd done, though living felt like the wrong word. He existed, day after day, in a stripped-down version of his old life, without the noise of boardrooms or the warmth of human connection. The city outside kept moving, its lights just as bright, its streets just as crowded, but for him, it might as well have been another world. And somewhere in that quiet, he began to understand the weight of what he'd lost. Not just his career, not just the relationships, but the version of himself he could still believe was a good man. That version was gone, and in its place stood someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. For those who remembered him before the fall, his story became a reminder of how quickly the image of success can twist into something darker. For those who only knew him after, he was simply a man with too much time, too many ghosts, and no one left to tell his side. The girl in the yellow dress never left him. Maybe she was a hallucination born of guilt. Maybe she was real in some way he could never explain. Either way, she was the last witness he had, the only one who had been there for every step of his unraveling. And as much as he wanted to escape her, a part of him understood she was the closest thing he had to the truth. Justice, morality, power. These were words that sounded clean on paper. But in his life they had been messy, shifting things, bent by money, influence, and human weakness. The truth was simpler. He had crossed a line, and once you cross it, there's no going back. In the end, that was the lesson his story left behind. Not that the powerful always fall, or that justice always wins, but that no one, no matter how untouchable they seem, is safe from the weight of their actions. And sometimes, the worst punishment isn't losing everything. It's having to live with the knowledge of what you've done, and the quiet certainty that somewhere, someone will always be watching.